Okay, Chapter 15, Secession and the Civil War. Alright, starting out looking at kind of where we left off with the last chapter with the election of 1860. Lincoln is elected president. He lacks a formal education. Has a background of being kind of a prairie lawyer. He's inaugurated as the first Republican president, and really he's assuring the Southerners at this point he has no intention of interfering with slavery, any other Southern institution. Instead, he really appeals that no state has the right to secede. Early on, his whole goal was to keep the Union together, not to change the South, not to work for emancipation. That goal is going to be something that comes about later. Secession is going to begin. The South had said if a Republican is elected president, we're gone. And that's what they do. South Carolina is the first to secede, declared that the United States was dissolved, and it takes South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas and form the Confederate States. In Montgomery, they established the Confederate States of America, vote down a lot of extreme ideas, keep things very similar to the U.S. government. They had to have a constitution, and resembles the U.S. Constitution, provided 6-year terms for the president and vice president, denied the Confederate Congress the power to have tariffs or to make tariffs, and to provide funds for internal improvements. It did prohibit an international slave trade, despite what most people thought might happen. Wants to restore things to how the Democrat Party was before the Republican Party came in. They want to bring some northern states in the Confederacy. They're trying to pull more people in. They will later. But before we could go to armed conflict over the dissolution of the Union, a couple things had to happen. You need to have some sort of an attempt at a compromise, and the North has to resolve to use military force. The last effort to compromise was the Crittenden Plan. It wanted to extend the Missouri Compromise line, which had been declared unconstitutional, to the Pacific. They wanted to provide federal compensation for escaped slaves. They wanted to have a constitutional amendment to protect slavery, all of which are a lot of Southern demands. And if you are wondering what was the North's part of the compromise, basically to keep the Union together. All of this fails. Lincoln rejects it, argues it's against the Republican position, does not think it'll end secession, and sees it as going against Republican principles in general. Buchanan, the lame duck president at this point, the one who's just waiting until Lincoln's inaugurated, he says, you know what, some wish to just let the South depart in peace. South believed they were within rights to secede. Many people just wanted to let them go in peace. And it's not going to be until they realize that, oh, we need the South's economy, people are going to start to be willing to fight back. They met at a peace convention, 1861. Representatives from 21 of 34 states gathered in Washington. A lot of proposals, very similar to the Crittenden Compromise, none of which worked. By the way, Crittenden was John Crittenden. He was a know-nothing senator. I'm trying to remember where he was from. But anyways, his plan ultimately did not pass. So there's a map of secession. Zoomed out view. Alright, so the war is going to begin at Fort Sumter. The North wants to preserve the Union. The North has kind of given up on this peaceful secession idea when they realize that the Cotton States are gone, and they're much more open to the idea of bringing them back in. Fort Sumter, South Carolina, in the harbor of Charleston. They were cut off from vital supplies. Fort Sumter, first of all, was a Union fort, and Lincoln had promised to defend federal forts. Had not tried to recapture any of them, but he had promised to defend them. So Lincoln will send supplies to the Union troops at Fort Sumter, and instead of leaving it or trying to defend it, he sends supplies. And so it basically gives the South a choice to allow it or not. Basically forces the South to take the first shot, which they do. Fires on the Union ships for 40 hours. No lives were lost. The Northerners, basically, the whole significance of this is that the North finally goes, you know what, we're ready to fight. Leaders of the Confederacy. It's a good breakdown of the resources going into the war between the North and South. Everything was on the North's advantage except for cotton and donkeys, basically, so definitely had an advantage. But at any point you want to look at these longer, just pause it, and otherwise I'm just going to flip through them. A lot of pictures. Okay, so Lincoln acts in very unprecedented ways, drawing on his powers as chief executive and commander-in-chief, often without the authorization of Congress. But April 15th, he's going to call out the northern state militias to suppress the South. He calls for 75,000 militiamen from the northern state, or from the loyal states, for short-term service. He expands his federal executive power without congressional consent, with troops authorizing spending for war, also suspends the writ of habeas corpus, which basically, the writ of habeas corpus is when someone's arrested. It's that due process where you can only be held for so long without being charged with something, without getting a trial. Basically, your rights when you're arrested. All of that's suspended, so basically they can just imprison people that they think are working against the Union for as long as they want to. The Upper South will secede after this. 4 more states secede when it becomes clear that Lincoln wants to use troops in this whole crisis. They are not willing to coerce the southern states, so instead they secede, join the Confederacy. Confederate capitals move to Richmond at that point, and the people of Western Virginia remain loyal to the Union and break off and make a whole separate state, hence West Virginia. Border states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, stay with the Union because they're loyal to it. They like the way that Lincoln treats them, and so they're going to stay with the Union even though they're slave states. Alright, so Civil War was a total war, meaning it affects everything: society, the economy, the political system, the army, everything. Northern advantages included the railroad network that had 70% of the railroad, strong industry, 85% of the factories, superior navy, larger population. The North had 22 million to the South having 5.5 million. Much larger supply of food. Most of the farmland was in the North. South had some advantages: defensive war in home territory, long coastline, which was hard to blockade, as you can see in the picture. Cotton was a cash crop, so that gives them a close economic relationship with Great Britain, and an experienced military. Very, very strong military leaders. On the reverse side of it, disadvantages, obviously it's kind of the opposite. North had less experienced military, a divided support, have to fight in unfamiliar, hostile terrain. Southern disadvantages, a smaller population, less industry, all of that. Lincoln's strategy in this is 2 fronts: capture Richmond and to seize control of the Mississippi River and blockade the ports. So one side is to capture capital, the other side is to block them off from all supplies. That's later known as the Anaconda Plan, as it was named by Winfield Scott. First battle, after Fort Sumter and after we get the armies raised and we have some more shuffling of states, we're looking at the northern idea at this point was that it was going to be expected to be a very short war, no more than just a few weeks. The Battle of Bull Run, and you'll also see this known as the Battle of Manassas Junction. 30,000 federal troops marched from D.C. to attack the Confederate forces at Bull Run Creek, Manassas Junction. The basis for this, Union was doing pretty well, or kind of the sum up of this, Union was doing pretty well until Confederate reinforcements came with, Stonewall Jackson. Jackson counteracted, sent the Union troops panicking back to D.C. He was named Stonewall for holding the line. So the Union Army retreats along with the picnickers that were sitting there watching the battle happen. And the impact of it, the significance is the Union was shaken. All of a sudden they realized it's not going to be an easy battle, and the early myth of the war was done. The early phase of the war, Winfield Scott predicted that this would be not a short and polite war, but a long one, and so he comes up with the Anaconda Plan, that the Union would take the Mississippi River and then blockade the ports. Some of the naval actions, you have ironclad ships. That's something new. Confederates in Norfolk, Virginia fashioned an ironclad out of an abandoned Union ship, which became the Merrimack, and Union ironclad the Monitor. They fight till they basically come to a draw. But it's a new type of weaponry. All right, so initially building up the armies, both the North and the South had to turn people away. They had too many to arm and had to turn away about 200,000 in the South. Both get less volunteers when people realize this is going to be a long war. So both sides had to go to what was called conscription, or a draft. In the South, they make it a law, begins in 1862. All white males 18 to 35 were declared members of the Army for 3 years. Loopholes, later it was extended to 17 to 45. But there's some loopholes. If you could pay $500 cash or you own 20 or more slaves, you could get excused from service. In the North, the Enrollment Act, 1863, was the conscription of men, permitted men of wealth to hire a sub or to pay to avoid military service. Drafted men 20 to 45, or you could pay $300, or if you were a federal state office holder, you could get exempt. The response to this is there's a lot of riots. New York City has a lot of draft riots. Conscription led to a widespread panic and public opposition. The announcement of a draft lottery meant a lot of the working class, especially the Irish immigrants, took control of the streets, burning down the offices, factories, docks, even an orphanage of black children until the police could get order. A lot of the wrath was directed at the African American population, people blaming them for causing the war, threatening to take their jobs. And so there's 100 or so people that are killed before 5 battle-weary regiments come in from Gettysburg and restore order. So those that had just come in from fighting a battle had to come and calm people down that basically were trying to avoid actually fighting in the war that they were fighting in. So you can imagine it was a really great homecoming for them. Also, the peace at any price to Copperheads, very active among the working class in the cities. All right, on the home front, besides getting people, you also need to finance things. Financing the war for the North meant through taxes, bonds, paper money, led to mass inflation, much more so in the South. They increased the tariff and excise taxes, the moral tariff on imports and excise taxes, even on manufacturers, and pretty much every profession. For example, a butcher had to pay 30 cents for every head of beef he slaughtered, 10 cents for every hog, 5 cents for every sheep. You also have an income tax. Congress passes the Internal Revenue Act, which created the IRS. You have greenbacks, the paper currency. They authorized $450 million in paper currency. Greenbacks because of the papers, the bill's color. I said bonds. A lot of people make some quick fortunes with kind of taking advantage of being war profiteers, and private industry supplies armies pretty well, and meant sometimes meant poor quality, but also meant large profits for those who were supplying the supplies and providing the supplies. All right, Confederates, government arsenals were supplying the Confederate armies. They led to trying to financing, lots of inflation. Confederates printed more money the more they got into debt, and literally a wheelbarrow full of money could buy you like a small bag full of goods. Direct taxes on property, paper money, huge inflation, and the transportation system was inadequate, so they are not doing well. The Southern economy was hit pretty hard. Political leadership at this point, between the North and the South. Lincoln expands his wartime powers, declared martial law to keep order, imprisons subversives without trial, briefly closes down a few newspapers. A lot of critics in that. Eventually reopens them, but kind of tries to keep some of the negativity, at least initially, down. Jefferson Davis, Confederate president, more concerned with his military powers than anything else, so it kind of led him to be a less effective leader. And really kind of neglects the whole morale in the economy, paid very little attention to the fact that their economy was deteriorating, and lacks a lot of influence to state government, so his support was not as high as Lincoln's. All right, I'm going to stop there, and then I'll do a part 2 in just a minute.